Forum Borealis Paradigm Expansion.
Greetings from the north, and welcome to our forum, this time on the concept of a breakaway civilization. Our guest today is Richard Michael Dolan, the scholar who coined the term and provided a conceivable substantiation for this remarkable notion. He's an Oxford-educated historian and political analyst who's provided the foremost study on the history of unknown spacecrafts and other aerial objects, not only presenting sober facts, but also skilled interpretation and analysis of the material. As a genuine researcher, he obtains primary sources from government, military and intelligence documents, the US and Canadian National Archives, travels for interviews with leading figures in the national security community, which includes 5-star generals, retired admirals, highest-level CIA officers, world-famous scientists, briefers of presidents, and even some working within cover-up operations. As a regular conference speaker with countless appearances in media, radio, TV, film and broadcast all over the world, he's also delivered 6 presentations at the National Press Club in DC, as cited in the Washington Post. Go to our website for an extensive bio with full bibliography and links to all his different sites, which, like our series on the timeline of a breakaway civilization, concerns science, politics, classification, possible non-terrestrial involvement, and what all this means for our civilization. This is what Mr. Dolan now drops in to make a case for. Welcome to the forum, Richard.
Thank you, Al. I'm glad to be here.
Yes, and I have to congratulate you because you're actually our first guest after we purchased our new microphone.
Glad I made the cut.
Yeah, we had to. You should have heard the sound on the last tape.
Oh, okay.
I sounded like I was a robot trapped in a box drowning. So
Not a good, the drowning robots, we all love robots, but when they're drowning, it's just sad.
It is. And so now we can honor this interview with at least, if they are annoyed from this interview, it should be from what we are saying and not the sound of how we're saying it.
Exactly. That's the best way.
Okay. Well, I have to say before we begin that you are like a fresh breeze in the field of ufology. In many ways, it's fair to compare you with Jack Vallée. I've never been a UFO nut, to put it a little biased, and our show is not exactly on UFOs in themselves, but as you know, we can't avoid UFOs in this field anyway. But the first thing I want to say about you is that you have done a very decent historic record of 50 years of UFO phenomenon from 41 to 91.
Yes.
And you actually did what, for some weird reason, no one has done before you, just collecting and documenting what's out there.
I tried to collect and then describe as concisely and as accurately as I could each of what I felt were the most important events related to the UFO phenomenon from that period. And in addition to that, you probably would be ready to, I'm sure you were about to talk about this as well, but my work it's about collecting and documenting for sure, but it's also really about at least two other streams of thought, which one is simply the political implications of the UFO phenomenon. So in addition to looking at the reports themselves, the good ones as I see it, I'm trying always to understand what is the reaction to this phenomenon by what I've come to call the national security state, that is the military and intelligence communities who have been interacting with us. What do they think about it? What have their thoughts been? Is there a cover-up? Are they confused by it? And so forth. So those questions are important to me. And then the third strand of thinking that goes into those 2 volumes of history is where have the civilians been? Has there been, attempts to end secrecy? What is the development of civilian research on this phenomenon? Things of this particular sort. So I've always seen those three. It's like three legs of a chair. And for sure, though, I guess probably the main one is the collection of those cases. And in every case, I treat each one of those cases as a precious little gem. So I would uncover the gem and clean it up and find out, what's the best way that I can describe this and put this into a book so that other people can appreciate just what is important about it. And there's quite a few of those.
Yeah, sure. The two books that you so far have on this topic, what are they called?
Well, my 2 volumes of history, I published 4 books on the UFO subject. The 2 volumes of history that you were referring to are my first 2 books, and maybe they're the ones that got me known the most anyway. They're called UFOs and the National Security State. They're volumes 1 and 2. I've been saying for quite some time there will be a 3rd volume.
Yeah, I was going to press you for that.
No, it'll happen.
Yeah.
I'm actually working on another book in front of it. This is horrible for the readers of the 3rd volume because I wrote the first 2 books, and then instead of the 3rd volume, I published a book called AD After Disclosure, and then I just published another book a little over a year ago called UFOs for the 21st Century Mind. Both of those I wrote for very important reasons, but readers of the historical series, I think they keep wondering, hey, what's going on with your 3rd volume? And I actually have another book that I'm working on right now, which is not even a UFO book.
Could we get back to that book a little later? Because
for sure.
I have that on the agenda.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm excited about it. It's disturbing and interesting, but we'll do one thing at a time here.
Yeah, and I just want to say that the books you have covered the historical records for so far is from 1941 to 1991. Yeah. So in a way, those 2 other books you mentioned that you have published already are concerning the future. So there's actually a gap between 91 and today.
Well, a little bit. In my last book, UFOs for the 21st Century Mind, there's an entire chapter dedicated to important UFO cases of the last 20 years. So that would cover it. And there's also a very contemporary political analysis of the cover-up of the science related to the UFO phenomenon. So I try to keep that one a little more up to date.
Like substantiating human scientific development connected to this?
Yes, absolutely.
That's like one of our pet guests here, Joseph Farrell. He's been into this for a while, trying to substantiate that you don't need to explain all the UFO technology with back engineering of crashed saucers. You're probably aware of this paradigm.
Absolutely. In fact, I referred to Joseph in my last book quite a bit, UFOs for the 21st Century Mind. I have a section that deals with the Breakaway Civilization, and of course, Joseph's thoughts are. We've chatted about this quite a bit. In terms of science, I just would point out that the science, the UFO phenomenon has been criticized by scientists for many, many years, for generations, primarily because they would say things like, "Well, it's impossible for a craft to do a zigzag maneuver at high speed because that would kill the pilot." Or it's impossible to have interstellar flight, or it's impossible for telepathic communications to exist, as are alleged by human beings and some of their other beings that they claim to be in touch with. And what you find when you look at contemporary science is that, in fact, our own science is at the point where we are easily now explaining many of these long-standing UFO mysteries that never made sense, but in fact they do make sense. And this is a phenomenon, in other words, that really intersects with the most leading-edge scientific work of our time.
Also, even if this less-known, groundbreaking science that is out there, and for some reason is not, we're not taking the consequences of how far we actually have developed. So yes, you're right, there is a precedence in science right now for many of these things. But even if there weren't, any statement starting with "it's impossible" could just be transcribed to "according to our current paradigm."
Absolutely.
That's not very scientific, is it?
No.
That's more like a historian talking.
Sure. Yeah. I think you couldn't have said it better.
Yeah.
Um, science is extremely important, but science is run by scientists who are human, and sometimes
I thought it was run by corporatism and states right now.
Well, yes, actually, you're quite right there. You are quite right.
Yeah, so, but there is even a fourth volume, I guess I'm sorry to say, that's missing in your work here, because there is grounds for a book that could cover cases prior to 41.
I agree.
I'm thinking as far back as you can go.
And fully
Would that ever be a task of yours, do you think?
I've thought about it many times.
Yes?
When I published my last book, UFOs for the 21st Century Mind, I intended that book to be an ideal first read for a sophisticated reader on the UFO phenomenon. So it included really everything that I felt was important, including the whole idea of ancient astronauts, ancient UFOs, to what extent we can understand that, including all of the history up to today, the philosophy of UFO investigations, the social implications of the UFO phenomenon, the scientific implications, the political, the deep politics, the types of encounters that people claim to have, and looking at the future. All of that I included in this last book. So there is a chapter on the ancient phenomenon. But of course, that's a subject that should warrant an entire book. I don't know whether I'll do it or not. It's each of these subjects that I've delved into in the UFO phenomenon have taken, like my first book took me 5 years. My second book took me longer than 5 years. They require just so much research. For me to do the ancient UFO phenomenon, I have a good understanding of it. I think I don't feel like I'm a novice, but it's a lot of work. And and the problem with the ancient UFO phenomenon, frankly, is really how much can we truly say? There's a lot of suggestive rock carvings. There are interesting, literary remains from ancient texts that. But what can you really?
Yeah, but now you're going very far back.
Yeah, well, so if you want to go back even a century or two, let's go back to the era that people like Charles Fort would look into when he was looking at 19th century UFO encounters. You can look at a lot of these, but really you're looking at newspaper accounts that never received investigation. And so what you have are stories, and I certainly agree that some of them are very intriguing, very interesting, but I don't know what conclusions we can really come to this by
Good point.
Studying it. So I've hesitated.
So your work is very much about follow the paper trail, the documentation.
Well, certainly that's what I try to do. This is a subject that it's a tremendous mystery. The phenomenon itself is intrinsically very difficult. I've come to the conclusion that we are dealing with an intelligence that is operating on a very different level than our own civilization. That's my opinion at the moment. And one that is filled with a great deal of what we would call strangeness. And so by itself, it's very difficult. But then on top of that, we're in a world in the 21st century, and particularly in my country, in the United States, that is moving toward a kind of a global totalitarian situation where information is not easy to get out of our government. Even with the UFO, there have been a few thousand pages of documents that have been released from the United States government through Freedom of Information. But primarily, most of those documents that we have were released about 40 years ago, during the late 70s. 4 years under Jimmy Carter gave us the majority of the released UFO documents that we have to this day. Incredible to say that.
No, I'm with you there. I mean, one of the perspectives of our forum is that, as you have heard before, many have this position, is that in a way democracy there was a coup when JFK was killed. And I think the Carter administration was like it's like 2 steps ahead and 1 back. So the Carter administration was like a little semi-democratic period there until the coup continued again afterwards.
Yeah, interesting way to look at it. I have a couple of different thoughts on Carter. I certainly agree that his presidency was during, I guess, what I grew up. I was a teenager in the Carter years. I remember this very well and studied Jimmy Carter. It was really the most, I guess, politically liberal moment in 20th century American politics, at least later 20th century American politics. I certainly agree with you regarding JFK, and I believe his assassination can really be described as a coup d'etat, for sure.
Yeah, we're getting back to all this later, if not in this forum today, maybe a future. I also have to tip you off. Our last guest, the poor fellow who had to suffer the bad microphone quality, he actually specializes in the 19th century. His name is Walter Bosley. And he has made a discovery connecting some dots that hasn't been related before, and that is the airship mystery of the 1890s. Yes, exactly. Yeah. And he's connected this to a group of German banksters, and some of them also occultists and nationalists. It was this milieu that the Nazi party raised from. And he's also connected it to very early bell technology regarding the Nazi bell. So if that's
1897 is a bit early. Obviously, there were no Nazis in 1897, but clearly, I'll have to listen to it.
Yeah, I suggest you listen to the show. We go into it. It's a divergent from anything called UFO history. And it's pretty new. You've probably heard the name Charles Delachaux or something like that. Yeah. It's his notebooks. But you can check that out later. It should be of interest to you, who's the primary UFO historian out there right now. Now, the other thing, I'm not done complimenting you here. I need to put this second point out there too before we begin. And that is that you are a brilliant analyzer, not just an historian, but you have managed to kind of separate this phenomenon where you introduce a new concept that has grown very popular, probably because it resonates and explains so much. This is the topic for today's show, and that's what everyone now has heard as the term breakaway civilization.
Yes.
And before you start explaining that, I want to ask you, how did you, as a serious scholar, get into ufology? Because normally academicians will be reluctant to touch it, partly due to the stigma in media and partly due to it being a career suicide. So could we start with you explaining how you at all came into this area?
Yeah. Yes, gladly. It was a little over 20 years ago. I was my whole life through my late teens and 20s. Everything was geared toward becoming a professor and teaching at an American university, teaching history. That was really always my love. And when I was a young man, I'd had some very excellent experiences in the academic world. I did receive a scholarship to study at Oxford University when I was 21 years old. It was a great experience. I studied under a Rhodes Scholar who encouraged me to apply for the Rhodes, and I did, and made the final cut. I didn't get the Rhodes, but I was in the running.
But did you go to Oxford?
I did, yes. I studied at Exeter College at Oxford University.
That's the same one that Joseph Farrell studied in, I think.
Yes, that's right. Yeah,
but it wasn't at the same time.
No. I think Joseph's a little bit older than me, and I don't even know what. I think I read which college he went to at Oxford. I was at Exeter.
We put up full biography of all the guests. We're going to out you too. So
I was in a certificate program. It wasn't a degree. I think he may have gotten a degree there, but I did go and I had a great experience.
Cool.
Made the final cut for a Rhodes Scholarship, which that was a weird, funny experience myself. And then as a result of not getting the Rhodes, I went to the University of Rochester for graduate work in history. And I did very well there. I studied European, mostly German history, a lot of Soviet studies. And my German wasn't the best. I did okay with it. It was I was in Berlin when the wall came down in 1989.
Wow.
I had hitchhiked across Germany in 87. 86, I was in East Germany on a German language program. Crazy times. And then I switched over to U.S. diplomacy in the early 90s. I took 1 year off. I went through my own crisis. at around the age 30. Had gotten married, had no money, and then I went back to the University of Rochester for U.S. diplomacy and excelled in the study there, and was working on that PhD in my very early 30s, and that was basically American Cold War studies, 1949, 1950, everything about Harry Truman. And then the job market for historians had bottomed out. It was just a bad time in the early 90s. It's still bad, actually. And I was in a bookstore with my wife at the time, and I saw a UFO conspiracy book. It was authored by Timothy Good. It's called Above Top Secret. The subtitle was what caught my attention, The Worldwide UFO Cover-Up. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Let's take a look at this book. I think my attitude at that time was I had a similar attitude that a lot of other people had about UFOs, which was I didn't really think about it. It wasn't really a big part of my life. But I'd wondered from time to time, gee, is there anything to these claims of visitation or claims of cover-up and so forth? And I think because I was studying really a key period in the history of UFOs, I was studying 1940s, 1950s in my own academic work. It was a bit jarring to me to see all of these references to 1940s and 50s in this book. So I bought the book and read it, and then I thought I would simply take out 2 or 3 months of my life and decide for myself, to my own satisfaction, what I thought about this phenomenon. I didn't like going through my life with this question mark hanging over me. Is this real? Is this nonsense? And what is it? What do I think about this? And those 2 or 3 months turned into the next 2 decades. And so what I discovered right away was the first thing I wanted to do is to find out what is the argument that these people who believe in the phenomenon have. Like, how strong is their argument? What is the basis of their claim? Do they have government documents? What are the good resources? So I did a bibliographic search, and I looked for declassified. The documents that did exist, I discovered there's quite a few. I read them.
Did you encounter books of Jacques Vallée at this point?
Yes, I did. Actually, it's interesting that you mentioned Jacques Vallée. I admire him very much. Vallée started writing about the UFO phenomenon in the mid-1960s. He was working with J. Allen Hynek, of course. What I did in those early years is I was like a human vacuum cleaner. It's impossible for me to describe. I had no UFO library, and this is in the 1990s, the mid-90s, so it's really pre-internet research primarily. There was internet, and I did use the internet to find books through library loan. That's primary. But anyway, I hunted down literally hundreds of books of the early period, including all of Vallée's early books, including all of Donald E. Kehoe's books and Edward Ruppelt's books and J. Allen Hynek's books and Coral and James Lorenzen's books and many, many others. And then what I did with them is I pillaged them for factual data. So when I would find a fact with a date, I would make a check mark in the margin of the book. And when I finished each book, I would collect all the check marks and put them in a chronological database that I was collecting on my computer. So, and with a citation, so I knew where I got the information from. So I was creating these chronologies.
So you were already starting without realizing it.
Exactly. And what you do when you start creating chronologies like that, you really are able to see things that you'd otherwise miss, particularly when you begin to combine chronologies from different sources, different books, and you start finding correlations. And the next thing I knew, the chronology that I created was nearly a 500-page book itself. And I thought, well, I'm just going to write my book. And that's actually how my first book, UFOs for the National Security State, the first volume, that's how that came out. I did very meticulous research, creating a chronology. And then I took the data and tried to organize it just in the best way that I could, I suppose, and to do the best type of analysis of that data that I could do. And that's how it happened. That's exactly. And I've done that with I did that with my second volume of history, which covers 1973 to 91, and that is the case with the third volume, which I have an enormous. The chronology that I've created now is would be a 3,000-page book if I were to publish it.
Right.
It's rather long.
But how did you come to the realization that we're dealing with a breakaway civilization here?
Right.
And where did you first publish this notion?
I'm glad you asked. So I was writing my second volume of UFOs in the National Security State, and in fact in the 9th chapter of that book, I published that book in 2009. So that's the first time that the phrase breakaway civilization appeared in print anywhere. That was in 2009, the summer of 2009 when I published that book. The idea came to me when I was writing that book. I'm thinking in late in the day, maybe 07, 08. I have to go through my notes, probably early 2008, I would bet you. And it's in the 9th and final major chapter of the book. I don't even have it in front of me, but that chapter opens with an analysis of the cover-up as I understood it at that time. So I'd gone through most of the historical narrative of the phenomenon, and then I opened the 9th chapter with I think a 3,000 or 4,000 word subsection in there that described the analysis of the cover-up, and that was where I introduced the idea of a breakaway civilization in that section. Perhaps in the introduction of the book as well. After I did it, I can't remember, but that's where it was, and the way that I came up with it, this was an idea that truly evolved in my mind for quite a while. And I would just say that I am a historian by training, but I think at heart I'll always be a philosopher, and I try to look at the UFO phenomenon in philosophical terms. And I have always tried to be original in the way that I think about this. So when I thought about the idea of a breakaway civilization, this is actually one of a long list of ideas in the UFO field that I've been putting out there that I feel were first. I think that I was the first UFO author, for example, to talk at great length about the influence of artificial intelligence in the UFO phenomenon. I did that shortly after I first published my first book. I talked about what I called invisible fascism encroaching in the world shortly after 9/11.
Oh yeah.
I felt that I could never just be satisfied with writing a historical chronology and a fact base. I have to provide my own analysis and see this in its original way. So the idea of a breakaway civilization, though, it's actually a simple idea, but it's based on a few premises. So premise number one is, was there acquired technology through crash retrievals of UFOs? And I believe the answer to that is yes. I've described why I believe this many times, but there are, in fact, many actually good and detailed accounts of what appear to be, human institutions, military institutions, where they have alien technology and bodies. I personally have spoken to quite a few of these individuals.
Alien as in unknown.
Alien as an extraterrestrial.
Okay, so if there were like humans on the moon crashing, you wouldn't call that an alien?
Well, I would call that pretty damned interesting.
So my point is that, first of all, your books are excellent in that you can either take your analysis and run with it, as many have done.
Yeah, that's right.
Or you can just relate to the stuff itself, the historical recordings.
And
itself.
honestly, look, I'm sure, I have no doubt that a lot of the any of the ideas that I've speculated on, I'm sure some of them are wrong. I'm sure some have been, and I will always reserve the right to be wrong in the future. That's just like
yeah, but my point is, where do you take that extra step and conclude that something is alien?
Yeah,
and I'm just being the devil's lawyer here. Yeah.
No, that's fine. And the reason that I have that conclusion is because in my second volume of UFOs in the National Security State, actually one of the things that I spent a lot of time doing was to go over leaked accounts of crash retrievals, leaked accounts of military insiders speaking to a variety of UFO researchers, giving their story. This is all something that really began to come out in the late 1970s and through the 1980s. And what I tried to do is to really look carefully at those stories and ask myself, is this disinformation or can there be something to it? And my conclusion then and now is that there's too much of this, and this looks like it's legitimate. And so I've concluded that I think there's something to it, that there are a number of these stories out there, that we did recover something at, for example, Roswell, I also believe Aztec, New Mexico in 1948. There was an event in Las Vegas, outside Las Vegas in 1962 that I think is quite significant. And there are a number of other ones, frankly. There's quite a few. When you start going through all of them, and I don't claim that all of them are extraterrestrial crafts, but some of them are really suggestive.
So you're talking about something so exotic that it breaks with the current human scientific status.
Something so exotic in terms of the technology and in terms of the bodies that are recovered. They don't appear to be human in many cases. So that's an assumption I started with. Now, you don't have to have an extraterrestrial assumption to devise the idea of a breakaway civilization. But you're asking me how I came to it, and I came to it through a series of assumptions, and that was my first assumption, that they recovered technology. Assumption number 2 was that this technology has been studied at deeply, deeply, deeply classified levels. Now, this is something that I think everyone can probably agree on. So you have classified scientific breakthroughs that the public is not permitted to explore. So, for example, if you continue with the extraterrestrial model of this, you have brilliant scientists in private industry contracted through the Pentagon to study one or another specific aspect of this technology, and enough genius scientists working on it come up with some nifty ideas. They may come up with, whether it's lasers or fiber optics or high tensile fibers, those are money makers. But what if they come up with even better ideas? For example, new energy paradigms, something that replaces petroleum, or anti-gravity in some sort, some field propulsion technology, whether it's electrogravitics or geomagnetic principles.
Or, like they always do in the military-industrial complex, devise a new kind of super weapon based on this technology.
Oh yeah, weaponizing the technology is very key.
Yeah.
So my point is this: in terms of energy, in terms of propulsion, if those breakthroughs were made, if, in other words, they're trying to make their own flying saucer. If you recover a flying saucer, presumably you're going to try to reproduce it yourself. And if you have some success, do you tell the world? And the answer is no, you do not tell the world. If you tell the world, there goes the petroleum industry, which owns all of you anyway. And that's just not going to happen. And why would you replace the petroleum industry in 1960, let's say, when, by those ideas at the time, there's enough oil to last forever. And based on 1960 levels of consumption, it certainly would have lasted, we'd have a lot easier time of it. Why rock the boat? So, no, their idea would be keep this breakthrough secret. And so what would happen is you classify the breakthrough, you allow the classified world to continue while the rest of the world's future is basically being held hostage. And this is the way the science progresses. You have one breakthrough that can lead to another, which can lead to another. But if a key breakthrough is being withheld from the general public, they're going to advance much more slowly than the people in the classified world who have a completely different scientific understanding, which would allow them to create objects, let us say their own flying craft, their own flying saucers, of which there are countless leaks emanating from the classified world at this point, including the black triangles and much more. And so what are they doing with these craft? Well, they're not using them for ordinary military conflict, for an ordinary geopolitical warfare. That's too low a level for them. The mission for these is much more classified, and the mission for these would be to go off-world. Unless someone thinks that this is ridiculous, I would remind them that in the history of United States military encounters, there's been a number of cases where classified U.S. technology was held back because using it in a certain conflict was not at a high enough classification level. Even something as simple as the 1986 bombing of Libya by the United States, which was done by F-111 jet interceptors, was not done by the stealth fighter, which was operational at the time and classified, because using the stealth fighter would have given its secret away, and they felt the Libya bombing wasn't important enough. So this is an old principle in the American military. And I would suggest that something as highly classified as our own flying saucer technology would not be used simply for warfare in Iraq or Afghanistan or anywhere else. It would be used for going off-world.
So there's a precedence for them sitting on the latest technology and only releasing it after a long while when it's long been made obsolete by new discoveries. That's what you're saying.
Yes, yeah. That's exactly it. And so in the case of breakaway technology, the question is, and this is me formulating this idea back in 2008, asking, what would they be using this for? And I think that they would be using this to go off-world. And then on top of that, I started looking at a lot of leaks that came to me in conversations that I had. So, for example, one conversation, and I believe I referenced this in my the first time I wrote about this idea. I had a conversation with a scientist. He's actually very well known. I will release his name one day. He was a civilian contractor to the NSA back in 1965. So way, way, way back. The NSA,
and he's still alive.
He's still alive. He's I'm very friendly with him. He in 1965, the NSA had only recently been publicized as an organization at all. It was the first book ever to discuss the NSA came out in 1964. So and it had not. No one had even known there was an NSA prior to 1964, essentially. So he's in 1965. He's a civilian there, and he told me point blank the NSA back then was operating computers that had a clock speed of 650 megahertz. Now, to put that in perspective, I mean, today 650 megahertz is very slow. It's anything is faster than that. But that's a clock speed that was not matched by the consumer market until the year 2000. So about 35 years later. So on that basis, you could say the NSA was 35 years ahead of the world consumer market for computers. Aside from the fact that in 1965, no one had computers at all.
Or knew who the NSA was.
No, exactly.
When were they founded?
They were founded in 1952.
Right, so 10 years at least in secret.
That's right, in complete secrecy. People joke, they say NSA stands for no such agency. But my point is simply this, that you have an example of an agency that, in fact, nobody even knew about, that had perhaps some of the most advanced computing in the world, maybe the most advanced computing in the world, decades ahead of the rest of the world. So we have this example, and there are others. There are many, many. These are all leaks, all unofficial statements, but there are so many of them coming from individuals who worked at places like Area 51 and Groom Lake and talk about how advanced the technology is. And I started looking at these. So there was a journalist in the 1980s named James Goodall who did a great deal of work at Groom Lake and Area 51, interviewed a number of people there. One was in the mid-1980s with 11 years experience at Groom, said to him, "We have things in the Nevada desert that would make George Lucas envious." George Lucas of Star Wars.
Who was this again? Who said that?
This is an 11-year veteran of Groom Lake and the classified programs.
Right.
We have programs out there that would make George Lucas envious. I mean, that's a very, very, and he continued. He said, better than Star Wars, better than Star Trek, better than anything you can see in the movies.
This resembles what I think it was one of the Lockheed Martin people said about going to the moon and back again before lunch, or would make E.T. envious. That's another statement out there. Do you know which people said these two things?
Well, the E.T. I don't know if you're referring to Ben Rich, who
that's one of them.
Ben Rich was the he succeeded Kelly Johnson as the head of Lockheed's most prestigious division, Skunk Works, and so the guys who did the U-2 aircraft and the SR-71 Blackbird. These are real hot shots. And Ben Rich was an amazing man. Toward the end of his life, Ben Rich in the 1980s and 90s made a number of statements that were very, very suggestive and I guess we should say pro ET in describing their reality. In 1993, not long before he died in 95. Ben Rich gave a talk at the UCLA school, I think an alumni gathering, School of Engineering, and someone that I know actually was in attendance there, and that's the current leader of the organization MUFON, Jan Harzan. I've spoken to Jan about this, in fact, many times. But Ben Rich gave a lecture there, and it was basically on kind of standard Lockheed technology. But then he ended it with the statement, "We now have the technology to take ET home, and it won't take a lifetime to do it." And with that, he ended it, and a lot of people, just being boring, uncurious people, they just filed out of the room. But a few people stayed behind, and they surrounded him.
They took the bait.
Like 10 people, and said, "Wait, what are you talking about?" Jan Harzan was one of these people, and Ben Rich talked for a few minutes very explicitly about what he meant, and he said, "Yes, we've discovered how to go to the stars. There was an error in the equations, and we corrected the error, and we now know how to travel to the stars." He said,
and this was presumably off the record.
This is all off the record, but Harzan was listening, and he wrote it all down, and so you can take Jan Harzan at his word if you choose. I do. And then he said, this secret, with the end of the Cold War, because this is 1993, this is information that should be made to the public, but it's so deeply locked up in the black world, the black budget world, that it would take an act of God, he said, to get it out.
And this was back in
1993, when Rich had this lecture. So there are statements like this, and like a number of others, that are really bizarre. There is a conversation that I personally had that made me think toward Breakaway Civilization. This is a conversation I had in the early 2000s with Russell Targ. Now, Russell Targ was one of the two main scientists who, on contract with the CIA, helped to develop their remote viewing program in the 1970s, along with Hal Puthoff of the Stanford Research Institute. And I know both of those gentlemen. Russell Targ, in a phone conversation, said to me, this is exact. He said, "Richard, in the early 1980s, I was charged with training remote viewers at Fort Meade, Maryland, whose job was to remote view the far side of the moon." And there was a bit of a pause on the phone, and I was asking myself, what do I say to this one? I mean, really, what do you say? The far side of them. I said, "Well, why would they do that, Russell?" And he said, "Why do you think?" And there was another pause on the phone, and I thought, all right, I'll just say it. So I asked him, "Okay, well, were they looking for ET on the far side of the moon?" I figured I would ask him. He didn't say maybe. He didn't say no. He said yes. He said yes, their job was to look for extraterrestrials on the far side of the moon.
And presumably this was part of the military remote viewing program, right?
Yeah, Fort Meade, Maryland was where the U.S. Army had their Stargate program, this is a remote viewing program. And Fort Meade, Maryland's also where the NSA headquarters happened to be. But it was clearly a military program. So then I asked him, well, did they find ET on the far side of the moon? And he said, that I do not know. That wasn't part of my my job assignment. But again, I just will have to say I believe Russell. And so if they were looking for ET on the far side of the moon in the early 1980s, I can only presume that they had reason to think that they would find ET if they looked on the far side of the moon. And they had reason to think that. Why would they think that? So when I consider things like this, and then all of the interesting anomalies that have occurred in Earth orbit and beyond that have been either recorded, and some of the videos are very interesting in my opinion, or described by astronauts and cosmonauts over the years, I think that there's activity in space that's not being discussed. So when I put all of these things together, it seems to me that there's an infrastructure that's out there, and it's a classified secret infrastructure. So when I asked myself, what is a civilization? The other thing that made me come on that phrase is, although I've always been studying UFOs, I study other things too, and I just been reading Arnold Toynbee. Arnold Toynbee was a true genius historian, and he did what was called a study of civilization, and really breaking down what is it that constitutes a true human civilization. And so this was very much in my mind, and I thought, within the classified world, their science is different. Their interactions are different. I mean, they have a completely different way of looking at the world. And so what is it that constitutes a unique civilization? And I thought, if I look at a lot of these different things, they really can constitute a separate civilization, one that is broken away from our own. And that's really how the phrase came into my mind.
What was this in any way tied to the already established scientific concept about a type 1 civilization, type 2, type 3, you know these terms, right?
Yeah. No, absolutely. These are, is it Freeman Dyson, I believe, who had those concepts, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, there's Michio Kaku talked about this as well.
He too.
Yeah, yeah. Right. I mean, certainly there are lots of people who've been thinking about, kind of a grand stepping back. What are these civilizations? What could they be like? I think these are all valid, important ways of looking at it. For me, I just thought, you can have a completely classified infrastructure. In fact, we had it in our own history. We had during the Cold War, we had an example in the 20th century of two very separate scientific infrastructures that did share some information, but also didn't share a lot of other information. And in fact, I remembered studying the history of Soviet science, Soviet biology. There was the kind of ridiculous case of the scientist Trofim Lysenko, who had a particular form of biological evolutionary theory that was based on Soviet communist principles, and it was such a scientific joke, but it was law to follow Lysenko's science during the 1940s and 50s, and it was only after Stalin died that became dethroned. It's an interesting thing to look up. But
so, like the Nazis, they had an ideological, accountable science.
Absolutely.
Huh.
Right. So, in other words, what we tend to think is that in our era, our science and our infrastructures are sort of, through the globalization, they're combining and they're merging, which I think overall is true. But there are other possibilities where you have breakaway ideas, as in the Soviet case, as in the Nazi case, and could you have a breakaway within the classified world? And the answer, I think, is absolutely yes. And then the question is, how secret, how advanced could it be? If you have something as exotic as extraterrestrial technology tossed into the mix, how far could it go? Now, again, if one doesn't want to accept ET technology, you could leave open the possibility that is some version of classified, let's say, Tesla technology. Joseph Farrell and a number of other people have speculated along these lines. Certainly, there's real possibilities there. I think, frankly, that is both. I think that there is classified Tesla tech. That's a very, very prime interest. But I do believe there's an ET component. And by the way, I would point out, unless Joseph's changed his mind again lately, last time I chatted with him about it, I think he really did accept the reality that there is an ET component to at least as well.
Not to answer on behalf of others, but my impression is that many of these people who are not ufologists per se, like Hoagland, like Farrell and others, of course they are open to the fact that there may be extraterrestrial components to this. I mean, to dismiss that would be crazy, but...
Oh, right, exactly. But I mean, when you read Farrell's work, he focuses on other things. It's really true. In my own conversations with him, I've never found that he had a problem with any of the ET.
No.
It-
But the point here is that when you coined the term breakaway civilization that has resonated with so many, it's kind of irrelevant where they got it from. The fact that they do have it is what makes this case so strong. And after Vallée, he introduced alternative explanations too, like it can be, it can be a time component to this. It can be time travelers.
Right.
It can be ancient antediluvian civilization technology. It can be people, humans, off planet. So there's many possibilities here. But I guess
No, I agree.
when you say extraterrestrial, you don't dismiss those alternatives, right?
No, not at all.
No.
I think I look at the it's almost I don't know if it's really true or not, but it's often popular for people thinking about this topic to dismiss the extraterrestrial hypothesis, maybe because it's just gotten so much attention, and it is the dominant sort of mainstream media way that we look at UFOs. And there, as Vallée would often say, I would really be disappointed if that was the true explanation. There's many more interesting things out there, which when we talk about things like dimensions, I mean, it's true. How do human beings perceive reality? Well, we perceive reality through space and through time. That's the way our brains work, and we perceive a certain type of dimensions. But if there are beings that have the ability to manipulate space and time in ways that we cannot understand, it would be like people coming into a pond and fish noticing that there's something here, if they have the ability to notice, and then the person leaves the pond. I mean, someone could be coming into our reality and then doing their thing and then just leaving. And we may not really have much of an ability to comprehend exactly all that they are doing. And I actually think this is the case, but that doesn't rule out an extraterrestrial component.
No.
I think, honestly, I'm doubtful that I, or maybe most of us, will actually ever really truly grasp the full enormity of what's happening. I happen to think the extraterrestrial explanation is probably the least problematic of all of them. When I look at all of these explanations, I find problems with some of them, whether it's an interdimensional aspect or time traveler aspect. When you really go, or just fully human, an ancient breakaway civilization. I've wondered a lot about this. Is it possible that ancient humans uncovered a great secret about how to manipulate the world, and have they kept?
And that can be back engineered like anything else if they have traces out there.
Yeah, exactly. So, so all of these are possibilities. To me, I'm very interested in thinking about those. At the same time, when I get too confused by all the possibilities, I come back to the main line, which is there is a reality. It is not being acknowledged. That is evidence of, let us call it, a cover-up and secrecy. And so let's start with step one. And I'm always happy to swim into the deep waters, but I want to remember where my feet can be on solid ground. And my feet are on solid ground when I notice that there are unexplained UFO reports that come from the United States military that were declassified during a brief golden moment in my nation's history that prove to me, they don't hint, they don't suggest, but they prove that there has been a phenomenon that is not being adequately explained by the powers that be, that the U.S. military and other militaries have been interacting with for years and years and years, and that it appears not to be of our civilization, and that sometimes it appears to be what I would call extraterrestrial. I mean, so all of that, I think, that's out in the public record. And so I try to remind myself, this is what I know, and then that's what I think things look like, and there's a big distinction there. I try to keep them separate.
With respect to Stephen Greer and others who are heavily on the ET wagon, I can appreciate the situation because we need evidence in order to not just be believers, right? And it is not easy to, provide evidence. Do you have an ET lying around? That would be handy.
Yeah, right, exactly.
But there are other. After I saw many years ago, I saw what's popularly called the NASA UFOs. You know what I refer?
Well, there's several documentaries dealing with Nazi UFOs. And
Yeah, many. Outer space.
they're on YouTube now.
Yeah, and there's so many of them, and some are so huge that my first thought when I looked at these plasma phenomenons were that could they be alive? Is this something organic? Is this some kind of life form living out there? Because there's so many of them. But my point here is not to, explain what they are. The point is that in order to entertain the breakaway civilization hypothesis, it must be substantiated by a UFO phenomenon upon technological aspects, and that's what you have a solid case for. Could one say that?
Yes, I think the most solid case that I've put together in my own career in doing this is to show that the UFO phenomenon is real, forgetting where it's from, what the origins are, that the phenomenon is real, that it's important, that it is considered important by national security elements in the U.S. and elsewhere, and that its existence is being officially denied, and we are obligated as citizens in what we still like to consider a free society to ask, why is this discrepancy here? I mean, why are you hiding this information, or at least seeming to hide this information? So I think we're obligated.
But you have explanations like Graham Hancock's that can be tied to mental psychic phenomenons, but there is no doubt a technological aspect to many UFOs, right?
Absolutely, and right. So I didn't think I understood your first question, but I get it now. So there is a mental aspect to it. There's a consciousness aspect that a lot of people like to focus on, and I like Graham's work in many ways. But there is definitely a technological component to this, and to me, that's of particular interest. Someone has got technology that's not supposed to exist, whether it's us or not us. Someone has got it, and I think that's important. Who's flying the black triangles? Well, we probably are flying the black triangles. Maybe after the break, or we can talk about that. But there are, I think there are definitely human-based technologies that are being operated that are truly breakaway. We've got technology here, and someone needs to do some explaining about it.
Yeah. Before we go to break here, is there anything else basic about the concept that can be said? Because in part 2 we'll have a license to speculate, but just about facts.
Right.
What else would you inform us about that has been relevant for the concept of a breakaway civilization?
It's a good question. Again, the idea, I would have to say that I don't know if any of us has actually been able to prove, how does one prove that a breakaway civilization exists other than breaking into a facility with a camcorder, recording it and coming out, or getting an officially released document? What we're doing is looking by inference. So my feeling is it's a series of if-then statements, and this is really how I came to it. If we've recovered exotic technology, if there's continued secrecy about it, if the breakthroughs have been made classified and were prevented from, and then you have all of these leaked accounts that have come out again and again. Then answering other questions, how would this be funded? I had long conversations with my friend Catherine Austin Fitz about the funding of the black budget breakaway civilization. Joseph, Catherine, and I are sort of we're three friends who really will talk about these ideas together every so often.
There's a very interesting aspect to it. But you mentioned leaks. What about this British hacker?
Gary McKinnon.
They went very hard after him. Yeah, he found something.
Yeah, Gary McKinnon, I think, is a very interesting case. So back in the 1990s, Gary was just hanging out at I think it was his girlfriend's apartment. So we're late 1990s computing technology. There's internet, and he was fascinated with the UFO cover-up. This was his motivation, and he went into websites, visited websites of various U.S. agencies, including U.S. Space Command. What he found is that their security protocols were not really all that impressive.
Mm-hmm. It was back in the 90s, after all.
Yeah, exactly, and he got in. He got into the U.S. Space Command website. He wasn't really trying to hack the site. He wasn't really truly hacking in the proper sense of the word, but it's like they left the door open and he got in and saw things that he reported about later, including the existence of what he seemed to believe was a secret space fleet, names of ships that did not appear in the U.S. Navy register, including references to non-terrestrial officers. That's what Gary McKinnon has claimed. Now, what we know for sure is that the United States, for over a decade, went after Gary McKinnon to arrest him and basically seemingly to want to imprison him at places like Guantanamo Bay. I mean, they went after him and tried to destroy his life, and he became a cause célèbre in the UK, and they prevented his extradition. But this was a long-winded, long-standing effort to get him. So I think it really speaks to his credibility. What you find in the news coverage of Gary McKinnon is that after the initial coverage discussed his UFO interests, all like subsequent news articles really ignored it. They never really said why he went into the U.S. Space Command website and what he was trying to look for. They just described him as the greatest hacker in the Defense Department history, which is also a lie.
Yeah.
But it's this UFO connection. And I spoke with Gary McKinnon on a couple of occasions, and he's a very decent guy. I think there is absolutely no reason to dispute what he claims he saw. You can try to reinterpret it in a different way, I suppose, but there's a lot to his story, and I think he is someone else who probably did get a peek at the Breakaway Civilization and secret space program.
Yeah, people had to rally around him in England for him not to be handed out to the American authorities. But if it was all the way back to the 90s, why did this get traction in the press more recently?
Well, he was arrested in 2002. So he was searching through websites through the late 90s. And I believe he made his actual breakthrough in 2000. I have notes on this. I'm just going off of memory. And so he continued from time to time to go in. And he, as I recall, he would taunt them. Like he would basically go into the site and let them know, ha, I'm here again. And I think he rather got off on that. And so they finally identified him and raided his apartment, and that was in 2002. Okay. So he did this for a little while. This is a long-standing interest of his.
He never handed out any evidence from what he found.
No, he wasn't able to get screenshots. This is on old PCs, 15 plus years ago, and it was trickier. I mean, would have been nice if he had had like a camera, took a picture of his TV monitor, things like that. He wasn't really what you would call a meticulous type of a researcher, not like yourself, or maybe not like I would have done. Like if we had gone in there, I think we would have probably been.
My save button would be permanently.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, Gary did not do this. I mean, he just wasn't. He wasn't really. He wasn't a scholar or researcher. He just was a guy who was interested,
He was a cowboy.
Exactly. So unfortunately, he didn't really take detailed notes.
Yeah, but from time to time, we see in less credible news releases that, in the Wikileaks, Assange have UFO documents, Snowden have UFO documents. Is there any truth to this? Have you any connection?
No, I've looked into this. So when a number of these stories come out, I always look into it, and there are certain websites out there that really do specialize in fake news, false news, and in particular with, I think it was a WikiLeaks connection where supposedly they had this important UFO disclosure information, and I have not found any of these sources that actually substantiate it. Now, there is the case when shortly before Bradley, now Chelsea Manning, was arrested. I think it was during that period, during the massive release of documents by WikiLeaks having to do with the Pentagon and their war crimes. There was a hint I think these were legitimate hints that there was some UFO data in the WikiLeaks documents. Now, the problem is we're talking thousands upon thousands and thousands of pages of documents, and it takes time to go through these things. Someone in WikiLeaks, not Assange, but someone else high up, said there's the equivalent of a nuclear bomb in what we have here.
Yeah, I read it.
And there actually was legitimate connection to the phenomenon at that time, but there's really been nothing to come out of it since then. My feeling is that it would have to be an inevitability that something could leak out. And I think a WikiLeaks type of phenomenon, an Edward Snowden type of release, I think, yes, this is the UFO phenomenon is just waiting to be released by someone of this sort who gets the data and puts it out there. It would be completely illegal, but that won't stop it from happening.
You know that you probably would be one of the candidates contacted.
Well, I don't know. I mean, if someone has something and they want to send it to me, I don't think they realize just how crazy my own life is at times. I mean, I'm sitting here in my bedroom. I'm not even fully dressed, and I've got stacks of books and papers everywhere. I live in a very modest life. If someone were to provide me with that information, I don't know what I would do, to be honest with you. I don't think I would turn them away, but it's very important because in this field, it's very easy to be taken in by false information.
Yeah.
And no one is impervious. No one, not myself, not anybody. And so the thing is, we all want to be as careful as possible. So if I were to be approached with information like that, I would definitely try to get as much research behind me as I could and have some other key people that I trust look at this.
Okay, but I want you to make a pledge here and now, and that is, if you ever are in a situation where you can talk in private with either Snowden, Assange, or Manning, promise that you will ask them about UFOs.
I do. I make that pledge. Yes, I promise.
Excellent.
I would actually love to have the opportunity to communicate with someone like Julian Assange. I mean, who am I? Julian Assange is still a prisoner in London, basically, and
well, I think you should be able to interview him, but it wouldn't be a private line, He's stuck in
the Ecuadorian embassy,
yeah.
London. Yeah, I would like to. I actually tried finding a way to get in touch with him. This is some time ago, and I didn't make much progress, but you never know. I would love to have a chance.
Try the official channels.
Yeah.
I'm sure WikiLeaks would help you out.
Well, they're not interested in promoting the UFO connection publicly, and I'm not even blaming them. It's just another albatross to wear around one's neck.
Oh, sure, but there are so many aspects that you could ask anyway. I mean, it's about the huge bureaucracy, false flag, intelligence, military.
Right,
There's a lot of connecting dots anyway. I think you could get something out of it.
And that's getting into some of my current research there as well.
Yeah, I will get back to that. I think we'll take a break now. And when we come back, we'll delve deeper into the Breakaway Civilization concept. And also, to listeners of our other shows, I'll pitch to Richard the two questions that has become a tradition now to ask almost all our guests about. So, yeah, you'll see what that is.
Okay.
All of our files are free and will remain free. If you like the show, you can show support by donating $1 to help with expenses. Just use the PayPal link on our website, YouTube channel, or Facebook page. Thanks.